Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland's schools are critical to the fortunes and future of our country. But after 17 years of SNP rule, pupils and teachers are being failed. The SNP's 2021 manifesto promised to increase teacher numbers by 3,500. Therefore, at the very least, they should be rising. So, First Minister, are they?
First Minister.
On Tuesday, the annual teacher census reported that there has been a reduction from last year to this year of 621 in teacher numbers, and that was the subject of a statement which the Cabinet Secretary for Education gave to Parliament on Tuesday. In response to that, the Government, as part of the budget settlement, has negotiated an agreement with local authorities in which the Government and local authorities will work together to ensure that teacher numbers are restored to 2023 levels, which means that over the course of the next year, teacher numbers will increase.
Russell Findlay.
Well, as the First Minister just admitted, Scottish Government figures this week show that teacher numbers are not up 3,500 as SNP promised, but down by 600 in this year alone. As Education Secretary, John Swinney himself promised more teachers, but instead there are fewer, and he won't ever accept responsibility. So does he at least accept that fewer teachers are having a negative impact in Scotland's classrooms?
First Minister.
President Officer, I want to see teacher numbers rising, which is why the Government has negotiated an agreement with local authorities, which is about restoring teacher numbers to their 2023 levels. But I think it's really important that we look at the outcomes that are achieved as a consequence of the investments made by the Government and by local authorities. So, figures published this week show record levels of attainment in literacy and numeracy in our schools, and the attainment gap in literacy has reduced to its lowest level ever. The attainment gap in positive destinations has reduced by 60%. The attainment gap in positive destinations has reduced by 60% since 2009-10. And now
Let us hear the First Minister.
And now 92.8% of school leavers were in positive destinations 9 months after leaving school in 2022-23. Now, many of these efforts were put in train by me as Education Secretary.
Let us hear the First Minister.
Many of these measures were put in place by me as Education Secretary, recognising that if we want to close the poverty-related attainment gap, poverty that has been made worse by the decisions of the last Conservative government in the United Kingdom, we have to take long-term action and have long-term commitment to strengthening education, and that's precisely what this government has delivered.
Russell Findlay.
I would need all day to list all of the SNP's broken promises on the attainment gap. The truth is, fewer teachers are being expected to do more, and this is fuelling a collapse in discipline in our schools. Last year alone, there were almost 45,000 recorded incidents of violence and abuse. One teacher told me that female pupils and teachers routinely suffer sexual intimidation and even violence. Girls are too scared to use mixed-sex toilets because they risk being photographed under cubicle doors. As a parent, I'd be worried. It would make my blood boil. Frankly, I would be on the warpath. These shocking incidents are happening because disruptive pupils know there are no consequences for their actions. And isn't it time for the SNP to crack down on the behaviour of the minority who are ruining it for the majority?
First Minister.
Well, the Government is taking forward action to address behaviour in our schools. It's part of the action plan that the Education Secretary has set out to Parliament, and schools are empowered to take decisions which are designed to address unacceptable behaviour. And let me make it absolutely crystal clear that any of the behaviour that Mr Findlay has recounted to Parliament today, which I know does take place in our schools, is completely and utterly intolerable within our schools. But what I cannot allow Mr Findlay to do is to denigrate the achievements made by our educators in our schools. Because when we have statistics published on Tuesday which show there are record levels of attainment and literacy and numeracy in our schools, I will not have that dedicated by the leader of the Conservative Party. And what I'll tell Mr Findlay is that the measures that have been taken by the last Conservative government to exacerbate poverty in our society have made the challenge ever greater to this government, but this government is going to deliver on Scottish education.
Russell Findlay.
I'll say this very slowly for the First Minister. He and his government have been entirely responsible for Scotland's education system for 17 years, no one else. And he talks about an action plan, but there was also a summit last year and it didn't achieve anything. If a nation's success was measured in talking shops, then Scotland would truly be world-leading. And instead of letting violence continue, the SNP must empower teachers to take a tougher approach where necessary. But all John Swinney has done is cut teacher numbers, he's broken promises, let standards slip and allowed toxic behaviour to spiral out of control. After 17 years of SNP rule, our schools need change. John Swinney's way is not working for pupils, it's not working for teachers and it's not working for parents. Isn't it plain common sense what our schools need? More discipline
Let us hear
and
Mr.
more
Findlay.
teachers.
First Minister.
I've made it clear that unacceptable behaviour in our schools must be tackled within our schools, and we have provided the approaches that are necessary to do that, and schools should feel empowered to do that. But how we will not be able to increase teacher numbers if we follow Mr Findlay's plans. Because this is now the third week I'm going to remind Parliament about the folly that Mr Findlay has put in front of us. He argues for a tax cut of £1 billion in public expenditure, which will reduce public spending by £1 billion, and the savings he has identified total £54 million. He has a £950 million gaping hole.
Let us hear the First Minister.
He has a 900...
First Minister, if I may, I am aware of loud shouts coming from across this chamber. If members have not been called to speak, please don't. First Minister.
There's a £950 million gaping hole of public spending cuts in Mr Findlay's plans, and when I watched him being interviewed on television on Sunday, he could not provide one specific answer to any of the issues about where the cuts would come. It was an embarrassing interview, which the Conservative Party should be embarrassed. Now, Presiding Officer, there are school pupils watching this exchange in the gallery today. And I would say quite simply this: if the behaviour of the Conservative Party in this chamber was prevalent in the schools of our country, that behaviour needs to be confronted, and the Conservatives are a disgrace in this Parliament.